April 1945. The Third Reich was in its final, agonizing death throes. Amidst the crumbling ruins of Nazi Germany, thousands of young women serving as military auxiliaries were gripped by a terror that went beyond the fear of losing the war. Among them was 22-year-old Helga Schneider, who carried a lethal secret sewn into the hem of her military tunic, a small glass capsule of cyanide. Her commanding officers had been crystal clear: if the Canadians capture you, use it. They were told that the Canadian savages were subhuman monsters who would subject female prisoners to unspeakable torture and starvation. For years, these women had been fed a steady diet of Nazi propaganda, convinced that the Allies were barbaric enemies of civilization. But as they were transported 6,000 kilometers away to the pristine wilderness of Ontario, Canada, they were about to encounter a reality that no German textbook could have prepared them for. It wasn't a torture chamber that shattered their worldviews. It was something far more devastating: a Saturday morning breakfast of fluffy pancakes and golden maple syrup. This is the incredible, true story of Camp 20, a place where a single taste of kindness became the most powerful weapon of the war, breaking a lifetime of brainwashing with the simple sweetness of freedom. To understand why a simple breakfast caused these women to break down in tears, we must first understand the architecture of fear built by the Nazi propaganda machine. By 1945, the German civilian and military population lived in a bubble of total misinformation. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, had spent a decade painting the Allies, especially the Canadians and Americans, as uncultured, violent, and primitive. For the women of the Wehrmacht Helferinnen, female auxiliaries, the fear was amplified. They were told stories of the wild Canadians, men who allegedly came from a land of untamed wilderness and had no concept of European mercy. They were warned that being taken to a Canadian POW camp meant being worked to death in mines or left to freeze in the Arctic tundra. This wasn't just idle talk, it was a state-sponsored survival strategy. The Nazi leadership wanted these women to choose suicide over surrender, fearing that if they were captured, they would realize the truth about the democratic world. When the capture finally happened, the psychological tension was at a breaking point. Many of these women had seen their cities turned to ash by Allied bombers. They had seen the brutality of the Eastern Front. When they were loaded onto the Empress of Scotland, the ship that would carry them across the Atlantic, many genuinely believed they were on a death ship. The Atlantic crossing was a journey of pure paranoia. Every time the ship lurched or a Canadian guard walked by, the women clutched their cyanide capsules. They expected to be fed scraps, kept in chains, or interrogated under bright lights. Instead, the first cracks in the propaganda appeared in the ship's dining hall. The Canadians didn't provide scraps, they provided white bread, a luxury that had vanished from Germany years earlier. But the women remained suspicious. "It's a trap," they whispered to one another. "They're fattening us up for something worse." This deep-seated suspicion was so strong that many women refused to sleep, convinced that the guards would burst into their cabins at any moment. When the ship finally docked and the women were moved by train toward Gravenhurst, Ontario, the sight from the windows was another shock. They saw towns with streetlights that actually worked. They saw shops with windows full of clothes and toys. They saw people who weren't starving. For a young woman who had lived through years of total war, the sight of a peaceful, prosperous Canada was almost as terrifying as a battlefield. It meant that everything they had been told about the failing, weak West was a lie. The arrival at Camp 20 was the final stage of this psychological buildup. The camp wasn't a series of dark dungeons. It was a former high-end summer resort converted into a military facility. There were real beds, clean sheets, and hot running water. The Canadian guards, mostly older men or those returning from the front, didn't look like the monsters from the posters. They looked like fathers and brothers. The stage was set for a confrontation, not of weapons, but of cultures. The women were waiting for the barbarism to start. Instead, they were told to wash up and prepare for their first weekend breakfast in Canada. The morning of the first Saturday at Camp 20 began like any other in a military facility, with the sound of a whistle. The German women, still clutching their suspicions and hidden cyanide capsules, filed into the mess hall. They were prepared for the worst. They expected watery soup, sawdust bread, or perhaps nothing at all. They sat at long wooden tables, shoulders tense, eyes darting toward the Canadian guards standing at the perimeter. But as the kitchen door swung open, the air in the room changed instantly. It wasn't the smell of war. It was the intoxicating sweet aroma of melting butter, heated griddles, and something rich and sugary that most of these women hadn't smelled in nearly a decade. Canadian cooks began placing large platters in the center of the tables. On them were stacks of thick, fluffy pancakes, golden brown and steaming hot. Beside them were bowls of fresh fruit, real butter, and small pitchers filled with a dark amber liquid, maple syrup. For a moment, there was total silence in the mess hall. The women stared at the food as if it were an alien substance. In Germany, by 1945, luxury food had ceased to exist. They had been living on black bread made with potato flour and ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. To see a mountain of white flour pancakes and real sugar was a sensory overload. One young prisoner, a girl barely 20 years old, reached out a trembling hand and took a piece. She dipped it into the syrup and took a bite. Then the crying started. It began with one woman, then another, until half the room was sobbing over their plates. The Canadian guards were confused. They thought perhaps the food was bad or the women were ill. But the tears weren't from physical pain. They were the result of a total psychological collapse. This was the pancake betrayal. The sweetness of the maple syrup didn't just taste good, it tasted like proof. It proved that their leaders, Hitler, Goebbels, and the High Command, had lied about everything. They had been told that the Allies were starving, that the savages in the West were desperate and primitive. Yet here they were, in a prison, being fed food that was better than what the elite of Berlin were eating. The presence of maple syrup, a uniquely Canadian treasure, became a symbol of the abundance of a free world. If the Canadians could afford to give enemies such a rich breakfast, it meant the Allied victory wasn't just inevitable, it was righteous. The cyanide capsules, once seen as a mercy, suddenly felt like a joke. Why would anyone kill themselves to escape a place that fed them pancakes? That morning, many of the women surreptitiously disposed of their poison. They realized that they didn't need protection from the Canadians, they needed protection from the lies they had been told back home. As the breakfast continued, the tension in the camp began to melt away. The guards noticed that the women stopped flinching when they walked by. The monsters had become the providers. This meal broke the back of the Nazi indoctrination in a way that no interrogation or lecture ever could. It was a victory of the kitchen over the battlefield. The women began to talk to the cooks, asking in broken English what this sweet water was. The cooks explained it was from the maple trees right outside the camp. This realization that the very land they were standing on provided such sweetness transformed Camp 20 from a place of detention into a place of discovery. The pancake breakfast became a weekly ritual, a landmark in their calendar that represented the transition from Nazi subjects to human beings. By the time the plates were cleared that first morning, the wild Canadians were no longer the enemy. They were the people who had brought them back to life with a stack of pancakes and a pitcher of syrup. The war, for these women, was effectively over, replaced by a deep, confusing, yet hopeful curiosity about the people who treated their prisoners like guests. As the initial shock of the pancake betrayal subsided, the women of Camp 20 began to experience a different kind of freedom. Because they were classified as low-risk prisoners, many were allowed to leave the camp during the day to work on local farms in the Gravenhurst area. This was a critical turning point. It moved them from the controlled environment of a military camp into the heart of Canadian family life. One of the most famous stories from this era involves a local family, the Morrisons. When the German women arrived at the Morrison Farm, they were prepared to be treated as slave labor. Instead, they were met by Mrs. Morrison, who didn't see Nazis. She saw exhausted, displaced young women who were thousands of miles from their mothers. On the very first day, instead of sending them straight to the fields, Mrs. Morrison invited them into her kitchen for tea. This interaction was the final nail in the coffin of Nazi ideology. The women watched as the Morrisons worked their own land, not out of a sense of state duty, but for their own family's future. The Canadians shared their rations, showed the women photos of their own sons fighting in Europe, and treated them with a casual, neighborly respect that was completely alien to the rigid, hierarchical society of the Third Reich. The German women began to learn English, not through forced lessons, but through conversation over farm work. They learned that the Canadian savages were actually farmers, shopkeepers, and parents who hated the war just as much as they did. The kindness of the local community acted as a soft power weapon. By the time the harvest was over, many of the women were no longer thinking about Germany's destiny. They were thinking about the strange, beautiful kindness of a Canadian farm wife who had given them a hand-knit sweater to keep them warm. This wasn't just labor. It was a re-education in what it meant to be human. By 1946, the time had come for the women of Camp 20 to be repatriated. But the women who boarded the trains to the coast were not the same terrified girls who had arrived a year earlier. They were leaving behind a land of plenty to return to a Germany that had been reduced to rubble and ash. As they packed their meager belongings, they didn't just take clothes. Many of them carried small, carefully sealed jars. Inside was the one thing they couldn't leave behind: Canadian maple syrup. The journey back was a harrowing descent into reality. When they crossed the border into Germany, the shock was physical. The 1,000-year Reich was gone, replaced by Trümmerfrauen, the women of the ruins, who were digging through mountains of bricks with their bare hands to find food or fuel. There were no pancakes here. There was only starvation, black markets, and the cold, hard reality of a defeated nation. The women from Camp 20 found themselves in a strange position. They were the fortunate ones because they had been captured by the Canadians. They returned to families who were skeletal and broken. In many cases, these women saved their families' lives with the stories they brought back and the supplies they had managed to squirrel away. But more than the food, it was the psychological medicine they carried. When their neighbors or relatives spoke of the evil allies or the cruel victors, these women spoke of the Morrisons. They spoke of the camp guards who shared their cigarettes. They spoke of the Saturday mornings in Ontario. The jars of maple syrup became treasures of truth. In the middle of a starving Berlin or Hamburg, a spoonful of that Canadian sweetness was proof that a better world existed. It was proof that the propaganda had been wrong, and that a path toward democracy and peace was possible. For many of these women, the memory of Camp 20 became their North Star during the dark years of German Reconstruction. They had seen the enemy, and the enemy had fed them. This realization allowed them to help rebuild a new, democratic Germany that looked toward the West, not with fear, but with a memory of kindness. The pancake betrayal had completed its work. It had turned former enemies into the first ambassadors of a new, peaceful Europe. The story of the women at Camp 20 is more than just a footnote in military history. It is a profound testament to the power of soft power. In the traditional sense, wars are won with tanks, artillery, and strategic bombings. But the peace, the lasting, enduring peace between nations, is won in the hearts and minds of the people. The Canadian government's decision to treat these women with dignity and the spontaneous kindness of the citizens of Gravenhurst did more to denazify these prisoners than any forced lecture or prison sentence ever could. Decades after the war, many of these women, now grandmothers and great-grandmothers in a modern democratic Germany, still spoke of their time in Ontario with a sense of wonder. Some even returned to Canada as tourists, visiting the remains of the camp and the farms where they once worked. They didn't return to visit a site of trauma. They returned to visit the place where they were reborn. They brought their children and grandchildren to show them the land that had shown them mercy when they least deserved it. The legacy of Camp 20 remains a proud chapter for Canada. It reminds us that even in the darkest moments of global conflict, there is a choice. You can meet hate with hate, or you can meet hate with a stack of pancakes and the gesture of human respect. This approach transformed thousands of potential enemies into lifelong friends of the West. It proved that the democratic model wasn't just militarily superior. It was morally superior because it didn't need to lie to its people to keep them loyal. It only needed to show them the truth of its abundance and its heart. For the modern viewer, this story is a powerful reminder of how easily propaganda can distort our view of the other. These women arrived in Canada ready to die for a lie, and they left ready to live for a truth. They learned that a barbarian is often just a neighbor you haven't shared a meal with yet. The pancake betrayal wasn't a betrayal of their country. It was a betrayal of the hatred that had been forced into their souls. As we look back at the history of World War II, we should remember the great battles like Normandy and Stalingrad, but we should also remember the quiet mornings in the Ontario wilderness. We should remember that sometimes the most effective way to defeat an enemy is to make them realize they aren't your enemy at all. The golden syrup of the Canadian maple trees did what 1,000 bombs could not. It brought sweetness back to a world that had gone bitter with war. And in that simple act of breakfast, the true victory of 1945 was achieved, the restoration of our shared humanity.